Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
There's a claim going around right now that there is a Christian revival happening in the United States. It's based on a few things that I'll show you in a moment. It may be true. It may not be true. We don't know just yet. There are certainly signs of one. But remember this idea here. Never underestimate the ability of Christians to get in the way of the gospel. We seem to have a talent for really messing these things up whenever the opportunity arises. I have long thought that the United States was due for another Christian revival. But what does a Christian revival mean? Typically, it means that America kind of returns to its Protestant roots. People start going to church more often, reading their Bibles, all that kind of thing, all of which is objectively better than where the country has been recently. But it usually means getting back to some form of Protestantism, including non-denominational Christianity, which I always love when non-denominational types say they're not Protestants, when by definition they are, since they're not Catholic or Orthodox, they're Protestants. But that's another topic for another time. But there are signs, and I'll show you a few of the signs here. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this, because the secular media, they don't like this at all. They're very, very, very concerned. You may have seen this floating around Fox the last couple days, or floating around Facebook the last few days. This is a screenshot from a Fox News video. They talk about how there's a Christian revival going on since 2022. Bible sales have gone up 41%. Since 2019, religion and spirituality app downloads have gone up 80%. And since 2019, Spotify streams of various types of Christian music have gone up 50%. And pretty sure they're being all-inclusive of Christian music in that. Everything from Gregorian chant to Christian extreme punk rock and everything in between counts as Christian music for the purposes of this. And I'm not going to exclude any Christian popular culture musician from calling themselves Christian music if they want to, for the purpose of this. That's probably fine. But if it were just that data, I'd still be skeptical, because this could also just be an indicator that more conservative elements of the culture are finally embracing smartphone technology and app downloads and the rest. But I'm not the only one who's noticed this. Go to BaptistNews.com with their headline from just a couple days ago. Now Christian nationalists claim we're having a revival. Have you seen somebody calling a group of Christians this? That tells you the kind of news outlet it is. So yes, Baptist News is apparently a left-wing, secularist kind of news website parading around calling itself Baptist. And I first encountered this actually in grad school. When I was in grad school, it was during like the Great Recession, and I had a campus job because that was about all you could get, the worst of it. But I worked with a Southern Baptist in an environment where we were like the only Christians in there. And later on, he became like this hyper liberal type. And it didn't even occur to him he might have a hard time having an Orthodox Protestant view, if there is such a thing, view of Christ and Christianity and living the gospel while having those kind of political views. So this is a kind of a problem here. And you might have seen this, honestly, if you're familiar with Baptists in general, or Protestants more broadly. But, you know, they're having a problem with the idea of there being a Christian revival, and they, maybe by definition, they don't like it. This is a tone you're going to see throughout a lot of these today. And I'm going to explicitly tie this to the U.S. bishops and the Catholic Church here in a moment. Look at this opening line here. Quote, "As the Christian church loses credibility worldwide due to egregious politicking." Interesting. Christian supremacists across the nation are tripping over themselves with excitement about a more positive storyline they see: revival. Although every other metric shows the church in America in numerical decline, these pumped up Pollyannas see things differently. A Christian revival across the country, the Fox News host celebrates as the screen displays a revival stats stock market style. Bible sales are increasing over 40% since 2022. Religion app downloads surging nearly 80%. That increased since 2019. And Christian music Spotify streams up 50% from 2019. Just in, stunning data reveals Christianity is surging in the United States. Eric Doherty of Florida Voice News announced with a red police car revolving light emoji. An amazing sight to see. A Christian revival is underway, TPUSA spokesman Andrew Colvett rejoiced. Reports show a surge in Christianity, affirming the visible revival happening across the United States. Live Action president and founder Lila Rose added, incredible news. Harvest is ripe, Megan Basham of the Daily Wire declared. And Christian nationalist worship leader Sean Fucht concluded, what we've been saying for years is now factually undeniable. A wave of revival is sweeping across America. In contrast, religion statistician Ryan Burge posted on social media today a definitive rebuttal. There's no empirical evidence of a religious revival happening in America. Let's go over his numbers. Among people born in the 2000s, 42% identify as Protestant or Catholic. 44% identify as non-religious, right? He shows you this to show that these things are, that the trend line is actually in reverse, basically meaning that it's going to get worse. Fewer people are religious. There, of course, the Baptist News' point with this is like the point you're going to see from some of these others, that this is just essentially a weaponization of the gospel coming from the secular right. If you need a critique of this from a right-wing source, if you want to call it right-wing, this is from the New York Times. Always be kind of worried when you see the New York Times employing a conservative writer. It's usually up to no good. The headline is, something is stirring in a Christian America and it's making me nervous. The article is written by David French, who never, ever failed to get the vapors when any form of actual conservatism started gaining a foothold in the United States. He is a definitely useful ally, if you want to call him that, for the secular left. After all, the New York Times, who never saw a tin pot dictator of the left they didn't want to give the Man of the Year award to, going back 100 plus years, by the way. Go look at some of the nastiest figures of Western history from 100 years ago. They were giving those guys awards for Man of the Year. So again, this is an organization that has no credibility to critique this stuff, but they are employing Mr. David French, someone who also has very little credibility. But this is the narrative you're going to see play out as this story possibly gains legs. And I say the story meaning whether or not there actually is some kind of a turnaround happening now in Christianity in America. There are possible signs there. But the biggest obstacle to that are the U.S. bishops, Catholics in general, broadly speaking, and of course, Protestants, more broadly speaking. Christians is a broad group. Whether we go, hey, maybe it would be a good time to, casually talk to my neighbor about these things, to start planting the seeds, not with any ill intent, but essentially working yourself into a position to be able to invite the person to go to church with you or whatever it is. Okay. To have that conversation about Christ and more eternal things. But this trend he's saying is making him nervous. Despite what you may have heard about the renewal of interest in religion in America, we are not experiencing a true revival, at least not yet. He is right about that. Instead, America is closer to a religious revolution. And the difference between revolution and revival is immensely important for the health of our country and of the Christian church in America. I'm not really sure a term I've never understood from Protestantism is the concept of a Christian church. Since they don't capitalize church, because they don't see it as a unified institution. When you have different Protestant groups proclaiming gospels that are fundamentally at odds with each other, let's look at sometimes how much Southern Baptists and other Baptists don't like each other, as just one example. I've never understood this kind of language of unity and Protestantism before, but whatever. At this point, it's almost beyond debate that something important is stirring in American religion. There's too much data and too many anecdotes to ignore. The steady decline of Christianity in America seems to have slowed, perhaps even paused. That, I think, is the best you're going to see for now, is that Christianity's decline has stopped. Because it is undeniable, as I'll show you, that younger people are showing more interest in religion. And I can tell you why that is. We're talking about the generation that grew up in a public school system that hammered absolutely deplorably evil stuff into their head. and told them how bad Christianity was while themselves being the very monsters they decried. That's what they grew up with. So they looked for something else. This is the same generation that's turning away from impure, indecent films on the internet at large numbers, giving themselves challenges to kick the habit every year. These are the same people who are rejecting use of controlled substances, rarely consuming alcohol, if at all. They are, in some very basic ways, more conservative in the personal way they live than previous generations are. And so it's not surprising that that same group would turn to Christianity for a stabilizing force in their life when every other thing in society is not stable at the moment. French continues saying, there's evidence that Gen Z men in particular are returning to church, and younger generations of Americans are now attending church slightly more regularly than older generations. Americans just witnessed an immense stadium filled to the brim with people mourning Charlie Kirk in a memorial service that was one part worship service, one part political rally. That's a fair assessment of the Kirk rally, by the way. And that service was replicated at smaller scale at vigils across America. And he goes on to talk about this, and then, of course, he links it to everyone's favorite boogeyman right now, Christian nationalism, because David French is a conservative who's meant to give credibility to the critiques of the left, of the right. That's what's going on with that. But there's another backdrop to this. And that's the Catholic side of this. Because we are witnessing something. And we're not the only ones who have noticed this. I've gone over this recently before, and you'll hear some of this data again, but RCIA classes are fuller than they've been in a while. There are more young people in RCIA. And if you wanted to talk about traditional masses, the typical traditional parish, you have a hard time finding a place to sit. Give me just an anecdote here at my own parish this weekend. We left a little later than usual this last Sunday, and there were already people an hour before the next mass showing up, trying to find a place to park. That's how it's getting, where it's always standing room only. Great place to be, by the way. Earlier this year, the New York Post noticed all of this published this article back in April, about a week before Pope Francis passed away, under the headline, Young People Are Converting to Catholicism en Masse, Driven by the Pandemic, the Internet, and Lax Alternatives. And it is those lax alternatives that I am most interested in. We have seen the number one driving force in the Catholic Church for people going from the ordinary form to the traditional Mass is laxity. They want something more rigid, something more connected to history and higher expectations. Because if you read the Bible, if you read the Gospels, if you read the writings of the saints, and then you compare what they're saying about the Christian life versus what you're hearing at the AMBO on Sundays and most normal parishes, there's something off in terms of what is expected of you. So people try to conform to what has always been, and they're looking for stability, and the traditional Mass offers it. It's one reason. And a lot of people first go to the traditional looking, the Novus Ordo, the reverent unicorn masses, as some call them. But you'll also encounter a number of people who saw that the unicorn masses was actually what broke them. Why they stopped going to the Novus Ordos. They went there and then they went to the traditional Mass. But regardless, we're seeing these across the board. Whether it's in the Novus Ordo, you're seeing tons of people coming in, or traditional parishes seem to be getting younger and younger. And when the New York Post is noticing this, they're not the only ones. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing that they're noticing. They begin with this anecdote, quote, Sidney Johnson grew up in a non-denominational Christian household, but now the Upper West Side millennial is a devout Catholic. There is something so beautiful and transcendent about the rituals and the ancient history in the Catholic Mass that's been preserved, Johnston, 30, told the Post. The church really communicates a degree of reverence that I didn't find in the more liberal, laissez-faire approach of non-denominational churches. And you'll also find a liberal, laissez-faire approach in many ordinary form parishes too. Confirmed in December 2024, the Church of Notre Dame in Morningside Heights, Johnston is one of the growing number of young people turning to the Catholic Church from other denominations, religions, and even no faith at all. According to the National Catholic Register, some dioceses are reporting year-over-year increases of 30% to 70% in new converts. The Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas, for instance, experienced a 72% jump in converts from just 2023 to 2024. These stupid and modest ads off of here. The Post spoke to several young new Catholics who cite the pandemic, the internet, and a distaste for lax Protestant alternatives, more reasons to return to faith. Growing up in Orange County, California, she never felt quite satisfied with the Protestant faith. It felt much more like a cultural experience than something that was really rooted in history with a deep theological foundation, she recalled. And we will leave that there because that is exactly the point. Why are people coming in to Christian churches now? They don't want the cultural experience. They want something deeper. We have been, especially with younger people, seeing a false gospel of materialism hammered into people. You see this in the confusion about the flesh, the ideology of the flesh being pushed. It's an utterly materialistic false gospel. You can just morph reality to fit your whims. That true happiness means just embracing who you are, including all your vices and things. And as long as you're nice and empathic with everyone else, everything is great. That's a false gospel. And people are waking up to it and seeking something else. And that's a good thing. At least you would think so. But coming with this is, of course, I think the quiet driving force behind the crushing of every traditional mass. I was notified by a viewer, and I'm trying to get the documents for this, but a viewer in a diocese that hasn't had this happen yet emailed me over the weekend to tell me that they were just given a 2-year expansion or extension for their traditional mass, and they were quite happy. The next day, they emailed me again to tell me that they had seen or gotten more information and had come with a caveat. It's a poison pill. They have been given a 2-year extension for their traditional mass, but it will include catechetical teachings on why the new mass is so great as they are beginning to convert to the new mass. That's what's happening. And I think, honestly, one of the reasons you're seeing this, things like this, is because of the large numbers of young people. Every institution in the culture, including the more progressive side of the church, which is the main part of the church these days, is trying to stop all of this from happening. What they don't want is authentic, hard-line Christianity. The understanding not just in the personal way you live about the reality of sin and its implication for you, but what happens when you institutionalize sin, or you institutionalize laxity, and you institutionalize license, and you allow it to spread without Christians standing up against it. On the one side, in the church today, in the Catholic Church today, this looks like this battle takes the most obvious form of, on the one side, the new synodal church of the new Advent, where everyone just kind of group hugs and sings Kumbaya together and walks together and journeys together and doesn't challenge each other to be better people. If you're going to have a conversion, make it an ecological conversion, as opposed to wrestling with your sins and knowing that, or keeping in words the minds of I believe it was Peter in the New Testament, saying to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That is not a synodal attitude. Now, on the other side of the new synodal church is, of course, traditionally minded Catholics, whether you're Novus Ordo or traditional Mass or Eastern Rite. I tend to not care that much when it comes to standing up against the revolution in the church these days. And there you will find people who understand the eternal consequences of sin and don't want to deal with them in the church. And that is why you get these kind of announcements. This is from the Washington Post. I can show you the Charlotte Latin Mass community actually posted the article to their Facebook page. But I'll have a link to an archived version of it so you can read the whole thing if you want. This is the Charlotte Latin Mass community talking about how the Washington Post has grabbed onto the story of their traditional Mass being crushed and are using it in the context of the American Christian revival going on and the challenge it is for the Pope. Wait till you hear this. The headline here is Traditionalists Push Pope Leo to Resurrect the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass has become toxically politicized and is posing a test for Pope Leo XIV as traditionalists call on him to reverse restrictions imposed by Pope Francis. This was posted on Sunday. They chose to publish this trash on Sunday. Here are the details. You won't believe this. Inside the frescoed nave of a church near the Colosseum Women in black veils and clean-cut young men listened in reverent silence to a largely forbidden rite, a Roman Catholic Mass in Latin. A celebrant in exquisite robes knelt with his back to the congregation, muttering in ancient tongue. Later he spoke of angels and demons and bemoaned the state of an overly permissive church. If the recent celebration of the Tridentine Latin Mass sounds like a throwback, it is. An ancient rite codified in the 16th century, the Latin Mass was phased out in the 1960s in favor of the modern Catholic Mass said in common vernacular. Nearly a half-century later, Pope Benedict XVI facilitated its revival, giving oxygen to ultra-conservatives in the Church, only for his successor, Francis, to reimpose strict limits, describing the Latin Mass as a backwards service for ideological Catholics. Now the arrival of a new pontiff, Leo XIV, has reinvigorated the campaign to turn the tide again, with influential conservative cardinals and other traditionalists strongly lobbying him to more broadly permit the old rite. For the new Chicago-born pope, the Church's internal war over the Latin Mass is a test as explosive as it is arcane. Rightly or wrongly, the Mass has become toxically politicized, its power to divide seeping into secular culture wars. There's the revival that they're talking about. In the call to widely permit the Latin Mass, opponents see a Trojan horse, filled with Catholics who pine for the absolutism and severity of a bygone church. The old and new Mass amount to, quote, two incompatible visions of the Church, said Andrea Grillo, a liberal Italian theologian widely seen as having influenced Francis's crackdown. That's putting it mildly. Andrea Grillo was thought to have helped write Traditionis Custodes. He also has recently said he doesn't basically think that Carlo Acutis is a saint since he's too rigid and clericalist and has a backwards view of the Eucharist. I covered that when it happened. It was mind-blowing to hear this guy talk about that. Yet a time when Leo's increasingly outspoken stances, favoring migrant protections and criticizing capitalism, have some traditionalists fretting about the rise of another liberal pope, proponents of the Latin Mass say lifting restrictions could be an easy way to extend an olive branch to conservatives who felt ostracized by Francis. We have turned the Mass into a battlefield between traditionalists and progressives, Cardinal Robert Serra, a staunch conservative, who recently raised the issue in an audience with Leo, told the French news outlet Tribune Chrétien. Most devout Catholics today, Serra argued, are those who attend the old rite. Everyone must be given space, he said. I think Leo will try to act in this way. The controversy predates the polarization of the Trump era, a polemic passage in previous versions of the old rite, which experts say is still said in hidden services despite tweaks made by Benedict, outraged Jewish groups for its reference to the blindness of them and overt call for their conversion. What he's referring to is the word perfidious used in the traditional Mass in reference to that group, which is in reference to the reference to the New Testament and things said in there. It was not a PC line, we'll say. That doesn't make it something that should have been removed. But anyway, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Latin Mass became a symbol of resistance for breakaway ultra-conservatives. Notice the language being deployed here. Breakaway ultra-conservatives. I mean, that's really not that different than Christian nationalists. Led by excommunicated, I'd put that in quotes, French Bishop Marcel Lefebvre. Lefebvre and his supporters, yada, 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 goes into the SSPX. Leo may feel compelled to weigh in. On each side of the Atlantic, but nowhere more than in the U.S., the Latin Mass is pitting priest against bishop and parishioner against parishioner in increasingly heated clashes. In the Diocese of Charlotte, for instance, Bishop Michael Martin, whom Francis appointed last year, has faced an outcry from traditionalists, including some local priests, for his move this month to bring the diocese into compliance with the Vatican by curbing the Latin Mass. On social media and blog posts, proponents of the Latin Mass have dubbed him a, quote, woke Protestant Catholic and a tyrant wolf and a Birkenstock-wearing Franciscan. Nice, I wish I thought of those labels myself. Supporters argued that the Latin services had inspired more young men to join the priesthood and were a touchstone for the devout. Debate, Martin said in an interview, is healthy in any diocese, but he said he worried that passions of the Latin Mass were reaching a fevered pitch. The things I've been called or the ways in which my intentions have been interpreted by people that could bump into me on the street and wouldn't know that it was me, I found surprising, he said. Well, hold on. Why would somebody bump into their bishop on the street and not know he's their bishop when a bishop dresses like a bishop, even in public? How could you not know your bishop who dresses like a bishop in public? I'd think if I ran into a guy wearing a cassock and wearing a pectoral cross, I'd probably figure out that he's not just a plumber walking down the street. You'd think that. Martin ended regular celebration of the old rite in 4 parishes, consolidating them to services. By the way, it goes on. If you're not familiar with the Charlotte story, the bishop later admitted that he purposely gave them a space too small for all the Catholics in the diocese who want the traditional Mass. Because what he did was bait born out of malice. And Traditionis Custodes and the documents that went with it, which is what he was enforcing, clearly say that Catholics dedicated to the traditional Mass in the pre-Vatican II form of the sacraments, the same Mass and the same sacraments that the saints had that are developed organically until 1962, that we're to be re-educated on how great the new things in the church are. That's what they said. Hence why I invoked at the beginning of the Latin Mass part of this what a parishioner told me was happening in their parish, that they'd been given an extension with a caveat that they all have to be educated on how wonderful the reforms of the sacraments were. Nothing will get in the way of a Christian revival more than bad Christian leaders. If you really, really, really want to convert the culture, you need Christian leaders. Whether it's the Protestant minister down the road trying to talk to lapsed Protestants about coming back to church and starting to pray again and starting to live as if they actually believe in Jesus, which would just be objectively better than where the country is right now, if that much happened. Or it's Catholics, lay Catholics, and Catholics, bishops and the rest, actually acting like they believe the gospel and believe they have a mission to bring non-believers and Protestants into the church, which right now we don't have that leadership. The synodal church does not believe in conversions. It simply doesn't. The leadership is a key topic right now. The U.S. bishops are getting ready to meet in the fall. They meet in the fall every year. And Michael Voris, church militant, used to cover this story practically every year. He would go down and put a camera and microphones in the bishops' faces as they had their annual meeting in Baltimore. They're about to have their annual meeting in Baltimore, and one of the things that's going to be up for grabs is the leadership position. Who is going to be the head of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, elected from among the ranks of the U.S. bishops? This is happening against the backdrop of an American-born pope who has essentially challenged, rather openly, the U.S. bishops and the church in America to take a firm stand against the Trump administration and its immigration policies. That is the backdrop this is happening against. Also, while there is a renewed push to fully enforce Traditionis Custodes, being directed by Rome. We know it's being directed by Rome because the big story on the Latin Mass enforcement that broke last week, the bishop admitted he got a directive from Rome to ban the Latin Mass in his diocese. So for this story, we go to the National Catholic Reporter. Never underestimate the willingness of the progressive wing of the Catholic media to tell you things they wouldn't normally tell you. The headline, who will be the next president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference? You got a picture of the Holy Father meeting with at least 2 bishops and their assistants. This is going to be interesting to see who emerges. My money's on a more progressive. That would fit with everything else happening in the church right now. Again, never underestimate the ability of these guys to, in light of all the new data we've gone over many times here on this channel, showing young people coming into the church and people coming into the church just broadly at higher numbers than until recently had been happening. Never underestimate the ability of the bishops to just mess all of this up. Here are the details. From the article, quote, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops released its slate of nominees for president and vice president of the conference. The election will be held next month when the bishops gather November 10th to 13th for their annual plenary meeting in Baltimore. The manner in which the bishops conduct these elections is strange. There are 10 candidates, and if no one candidate receives a majority of those votes on the first ballot, the same 10 candidates are then placed on the second ballot. You would think they would eliminate, say, the 5 nominees who got the lowest total on the first ballot, but they don't. If the second ballot does not produce a winner with a majority of the votes, the top 2 vote-getters proceed to a runoff which necessarily produces a winner. Then the bishops turn to the remaining 9 candidates and select a new vice president of the conference from them. For many years, the vice president moved up to the presidency at the end of the 3-year term, but in 2010, the bishops selected New York's Archbishop Timothy Dolan over the incumbent vice president, Bishop Gerald Kakanis of Tucson, Arizona. That was a shock election when it first became a clear majority of the bishops wanted to move in a different direction, away from the legacy of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin and towards a more explicitly conservative public face. I want to pause here and let you think about that for a second. In no sane world is Cardinal Dolan considered a conservative. But in comparison to Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, having Cardinal Dolan as the head of the Bishops' Conference is a turn to the more conservative. That is how far off the deep end the church in America has been for a very long time. In 2013, they returned to the usual practice, selecting Vice President Archbishop Joseph Kurtz as president, which also happened in 2016, and 2019 with Cardinal Daniel DiNardo and Archbishop Jose Gomez moving up from Veep to the top slot. In 2022, Archbishop Alan Vigneron was vice president, but was too old to stand for the presidency. The Vatican requires that anyone elected to a leadership role in a bishop's conference must be able to fill out his term before reaching the mandatory retirement age. And so in 2022, the bishop selected Archbishop Timothy Broglio as president and Archbishop William Laurie as vice president. Laurie is 74, cannot become president of the conference. So next month, the bishops will elect both a new president and a new vice president. What to make of the nominees? 5 of the 10 nominated would resist the path charted by Pope Francis and now embraced by Pope Leo. Instead of the Pope's more holistic approach to moral theology in the public square, these 5 candidates are associated with culture war approach, stigmatizing opponents, emphasizing the unique importance of the sacrifice to Moloch issue for all elections, and downplaying the importance of Catholic social teaching. And that right there is a weaponized phrase. And I will tell you why that is. Catholic social teaching is a comprehensive body of work that really got kicked off by Pope Leo XIII in a big way in the late 19th century. He coined the phrase Catholic social teaching, but popes before him had written on the subjects of economics and other things. For the progressive wing of the church, Catholic social teaching is distorted to essentially go after private property, to go and embrace socialism and to embrace social democracy and all sorts of other things the church really shouldn't be messing with. And in the US, it basically became an excuse to say, well, the sacrifice to Moloch, as we have to call it here on this platform, has the same moral weight as widespread unemployment. I'm not even joking. That is an example I've seen them use. This coming from the same people who dubbed the miracle of the loaves and the fishes in the Bible to a miracle of sharing. That Jesus really managed to have them all really empty their pockets and found there was enough food for everybody. Same crowd says that, has reduced Catholic social teaching to something that allows Catholic politicians to, well, be in favor of legal access to the sacrifice of the most vulnerable. That's what this is about. And it's one of those things that we have to take very seriously when they say this stuff, because they're right. There are 10 candidates, 5 of whom wouldn't actually be terrible. They at least stand up for Catholic morality, which seems to be the most we can hope for today. They include the Archbishop of Oklahoma City as a problematic candidacy. He's also pretty important in the Catholic Relief Services world, so take their description of him as ultra-conservative with a grain of salt. His role at the Napa Institute does not suggest he seeks a poor church for the poor. That's a Francis and Leo term. And his fulsome, never retracted praise for the disgraced former nuncio Carlo Maria Vigano have not won him many admirers in Rome. The bishops need someone who can conduct the conference's business in Rome. And then they give you their next boogeyman. Portland Archbishop Alexander Sample, best known for his enthusiasm for the traditional Mass, and support for Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone's decision to ban Nancy Pelosi from receiving communion in her home diocese. He never worked or studied in Rome, which is a deficit for his post. Bishop Kevin Rhodes of Fort Wayne, South Bend, Indiana, objected to Sample giving the Laetare Award to then Vice President Joe Biden, but did not voice any qualms about giving it to the person. Okay, so it wasn't Sample who gave the award to that person. But he also gave it to John Boehner. So you have all these guys. Bishop David Malloy of Rockford, Illinois. Bishop, who is, I believe, in the same spirit as Bishop Kakanis. What to make the nomination of Bishop Robert Barron? Many bishops appreciate his ability to communicate. Many others worry about the increasingly strident content of his communications. All recognize that his heart is in his word on fire ministry, not in diocesan leadership. Can't imagine he would be an effective administrator, and besides, in Rome, he is seen as too much of a showman. The only nominee who screams Pope Francis is Detroit's new Archbishop, Ed Weissenberger. he rightly addressed the scandal of not just dissent from, but animus towards the papal magisterium and the late Pope at Detroit's Sacred Heart Ministry. Yes, the author here, if you remember that story, Archbishop Weissenberger is the one who fired 3 very well-known theologians from that seminary because they were teaching Catholicism and Catholic morality to the priests. Here the author is celebrating that move and is hoping he becomes the president of the Bishops' Conference. And then, of course, for the rest of these guys, you get Archbishop Nelson Perez of Philadelphia, Archbishop Richard Henning, Cardinal Sean O'Malley, and a few others. And one of the things you'll get here is you'll see things like references to President Trump, immigration, and the rest. We're going to see here in the coming weeks. What you're going to see here in the coming weeks is this: a concerted effort to essentially have to direct the church's focus for the next year. Will the church continue full speed ahead on this immigration self-destructive path that it's on with the administration? A lot of Catholics are really, really upset with the tone-deaf language coming from Rome and coming from the American bishops on this, because it doesn't take into account the dignity of the person, of the people who live in the country, who are the victims of all sorts of heinous evils inflicted on them by the actions of the government regarding migrants, or by the migrants themselves, or who are having their towns, their states, their country undermined by this. And many people are upset about this. And so what's going to happen here in November is the bishops are going to select what the course is for the next year. Now, it could be they'll choose a sleeper candidate. Maybe another person will emerge who will be sort of a unifier, someone who will bridge the gap between a more conservative expression of American Catholicism and the more progressive, some charter of a middle path. And if it were somebody like that, my sleeper candidate for that is not a sleeper candidate. It would be to look to Cardinal Dolan, not to lead because he's retiring, but to have him pick a Dolan-like candidate. I'm very curious what you think about all this. So let me know in the comments. Trish says Bishop Barron doesn't really play ball. That's correct. He doesn't seem to be all that interested in taking these political sides, to his credit, actually. He'll say positive things about the current administration, which gets him a lot of flack. I had thought he'd be an archbishop here pretty soon. After that, I don't think he's going to be, or at least not anytime soon. But I'm very curious what you think about all of this, because, Dr. Obvious says, I seriously doubt any catechesis selling the not-so-shiny Novus Order will convince the TLM faithful. Right, but you have a group of traditionalist influencers telling you to do things like ignoring everything coming out of the Pope's mouth now, which is weird, or telling people to just go along and stop criticizing everything. And, if you get a reverent new mass in Latin, that's good enough. These are people who come from families that have been fighting for the traditional sacraments for decades. These are people who were given a position by God himself, essentially, to resist these things going on, and suddenly are not anymore. It's bizarre. So don't underestimate how many people will actually go along. Looming over this is the observation made by Taylor Marshall and a few others, going back years, that the plan for the Latin Mass looks like the elimination of it entirely, and traditionalists being sent off to go to the SSPX, where they'll be out of sight, out of mind, and treating the FSSP basically the same. A few parishes here and there across the country, out of sight, out of mind, literally in the toxic waste part of town, like my parish. That's what they're talking about. That's kind of what is looming over all of this. But I'm curious what you think about this, so let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. Pray for all these bishops we talked about. They need it. They'll need it for this discerning process, that maybe they listen to the will of God on this and not like the political meanderings and the political language going on in their meetings, but instead they listen to the will of God, and that they keep an eye towards the changing culture in the country, because it's becoming more Christian friendly. At least that much is happening. And there might very well be a Christian revival going on in the United States, or at least a potential for one, unless these men mess it all up. So always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.